Hello everyone and welcome to our online event. How can we tackle the lack of diversity at the top of higher education? So let's be upfront. When it comes to career progression for POC staff or BME staff, if we use the official language, it's a bit of a sorry picture. The Higher Education Statistics Agency found that most universities employed between 0 and 2 Black professors in 2018-2019. The following year, the agency noted that when it came to academic managers, directors and senior officials, just 20 were Asian compared with 435 who were white. I think it's safe to say that many universities do not reflect the makeup of their students or even the locations they're in. This is of pressing concern for a whole host of reasons, as I'm sure everyone in the audience is well aware of. We're not going to be talking about that today. What we will be talking about is how to actually, tangibly improve this situation, and hopefully a little bit quicker than we've been talking about it. So hello, by the way, my name's Coco Khan. I'm a journalist here at The Guardian with an interest in social justice and race equality. This event is being put on by Guardian Jobs and is kindly paid for by Gayton B. Sanderson. They're a UK business who specialise in leadership appointments in public services, also education and not-for-profit. These are sectors that are crucial for society, but are often faced with very complex issues and are often very scrutinised. So just a few words about this online event. We'll be live for 1 hour and 15 minutes. For the first 5 minutes or so, I'll be talking to Tessa Harrison. She's a partner of education at Gayton B. Sanderson. They've just conducted some research into the experience of recently appointed vice-chancellors and the impact of recruitment processes on senior leadership diversity. I'm hoping that some of those findings will provide some very useful context for the rest of our event. This will then be followed by our online discussion with our expert panel on why BME staff are underrepresented in senior roles in universities and what can be done to change this. After that, we'll take some questions from you. There's a couple of ways we'll be doing this. I know that some of you have sent your questions in advance, and thank you for those. Brilliant, and we'll try to fit in as many as I can. You can also send us written questions via the Q&A function on your screen. It's on the right of your window. And also feel free to be anonymous. I know that if you're working in the industry, you might feel nervous about asking questions, but we really do want this to be a vigorous and helpful debate. So please do send your questions in anonymously, if that will give you some confidence to do it. But of course, if you want to use your name, wonderful. Please do try to keep that Q&A box for questions only though. If you do have comments or technical issues, there's also a moderator chat option. I think that's on the right as well. So you can speak to our team like that. And finally, for any of you on social media, you can follow along using the hashtag GDN, so Guardian, diversity in HE. And yeah, the tags are @GuardianJobs and @GaytonBS. Right, okay, so that's the admin done, and let's get on to that research. So over the past 2 months, Gayton B. Sanderson have been interviewing vice-chancellors to understand university leadership today. Obviously, what's required of university leaders is drastically different to, say, 30 years ago. There's been deregulation of student numbers, increased marketisation, and then the pandemic came along. So what this report aims to understand is what's required of a university leader, and is our understanding of what a university leader should look like, well, is it up to date? So hello to Tessa, thank you for joining us today.
Hi Coco, thank you very much, and thank you for hosting this event with us. Very excited.
Great, lovely to have you. So I'll just get stuck in. So something that really stood out to me in the report was a line that said, and I'll just quote it, "There are also examples where candidates felt the point of the exercise," so this is VC candidates, felt the point of the assessment exercise for the job was to be assessed against a model of leadership that is no longer appropriate or relevant for higher education, which made me think, okay, so what is the appropriate model for current higher education leadership?
So there isn't one. I think it's important to say different organisations, different universities need different leaders at different times. It's probably fair to say that the model often in people's minds is still that of a middle-class white male academic and with some notable exceptions, that model is largely still very much reflected at the top of our universities. What Julia Roberts, my colleague, and I heard from the Vice-Chancellors and aspiring Vice-Chancellors we spoke to is that the process of finding university leaders has got to start from a very deep understanding of where the institution is at the point in which you're trying to recruit and where it needs to go in the context of the various communities it serves. We heard so many of our colleagues telling us about wishing there'd be more openness throughout the recruitment process about the skeletons in the cupboard, the things that weren't quite as they needed to be. And I think for us, this is about governing bodies and the search firms they work with being really honest and brave in holding up a mirror to the institution at that moment in time and using that to shape the priorities and therefore the skills, the experiences and qualities that they need for the next Vice-Chancellor. It's not good enough to say we don't want what we had before. You know, we really have to start from, the beginning. And if we're not being honest and transparent about the challenges that new Vice-Chancellors are going to face, how can we create the conditions for the search and the selection process so that we're really examining skills, experience and qualities and properly assessing for the role they're going to do? There's still too many assumptions being made about what the proper pathway is to get to Vice-Chancellor. And I think that is exacerbated by a persistent lack of diversity in governing bodies themselves. And I have to say, I think an unwillingness or even an inability, perhaps, to challenge the status quo on the part of executive search firm partners. So I think it's about making sure that we're really clear about what that organisation needs at that moment in time, planning the search and the selection processes around that, and crucially, putting mechanisms in place to onboard and transition colleagues into these big roles. Nobody's going to have it all at the beginning. And we learn so much about candidates in the search process, but how often do we take what we've learned about individuals through into meaningful development plans?
I just want to pick up on something you said at the beginning of there, because it just reminded me of so much of the reporting I've done. You talked about the middle class white man from the academic background, or should we say from the background that is everybody kind of knows that's the trajectory you would take. I've been writing about different sectors at The Guardian for a while, and it's funny because that is the same conversation being had across all professions, mine included, journalism and publishing. And perhaps naively, I might think that those issues that we're talking about in other sectors, unconscious bias, how certain demographics, women, for example, don't put themselves forward for roles, that wouldn't really happen in academic. Your report says otherwise, though, right? Those same issues can be found in university amply.
Right, so unconscious bias absolutely does exist in our universities. I've sat in enough leadership training exercises as a university leader to know that to be true. This is a really uncomfortable truth for higher education. Universities are places of enlightenment. They open up opportunities. They're about fostering understanding and tolerance, and yet there are a whole range of biases as there are everywhere. Look, what students and others are asking for from university leaders is to demonstrate a level of humility and personal responsibility for being transparent and not defensive about those biases, to open up, to be vulnerable, and critically to create the space for the whole community to learn how to be better together. But that takes a high degree of emotional, personal responsibility, and that's not always easy for university leaders, as it isn't for many universities. And I think this is where the discussion about individuals' values and principles is so important in any recruitment process. So often we heard the Vice-Chancellors that we spoke to tell us that these critically important conversations were either actually quite superficial or they just didn't happen at all. And this surely must relate back to the biases of everyone involved in recruiting university leaders, and actually a certain degree of laziness about this term we use, cultural fit. So much more needs to be done across the board, and we've got to work harder together to eradicate it. But first, we need everyone to admit it, and then we can move on.
Great. So on on points about what can actually be changed, admitting it, of course, but I understand this report had some key recommendations, and I'd really like to hear some of those, just things that can be done today to move this issue forward.
We had three main recommendations, and colleagues who read the report will see how we landed with these three. First is what we euphemistically call the leadership pipeline. I mean, quite simply, if universities don't invest in leadership at every level, there just won't be any leaders in the future. So that we use the term leadership pipeline as a shorthand way of saying we need to see preparation for leadership as a real thing. That everybody involved in finding and developing people in our universities takes responsibility for, but also seeing development of leadership as a partner to thinking about people's research careers or their professional service career development, that these things are dealt with at the same time. Leadership isn't something you add on when you need to get to it. It needs to be something that we talk about and embrace and support all the time. We also made some recommendations about assessment. It goes back to what I said before about what are we assessing. There is so much to do to, I think, challenge established ways of doing things, find innovative ways of assessing skills, experience and qualities. I know from our own experience, not just accepting it particularly when women say, oh, that's not a role for me. Let's go back. Why do you think it's not a role for you? Is it that classic, I can't do 100% of this? Therefore, I'm not going to apply. So I think executive search firms have a massive responsibility not to take at face value some of the comments that we get from candidates about whether they can or shouldn't apply for a role. But we've got to get much smarter about our assessment methods. And then the final thing was candidate care. I think if Julia was here with me now, she would say some of the most distressing elements of our conversations with Vice Chancellors were the stories we heard about their candidate experience of the search and selection process. Candidates invest enormous amounts of themselves in these processes, and we've got to respect that and take care of them regardless of the outcome.
Great. Well, thank you, Tessa. I am conscious of time, and there's so much more in that report. I'm sure I'll see if we can work some magic in the background and get it sent around to the attendees, because there's lots of really great stuff in there. But yes, so I just wanted to introduce our panel, really. So just a reminder to the audience on the questions, send them as and when you wish. We will come to them in about 30 minutes or so. If you want to ask a question, Q&A function to the right of your screen, use your name or anonymously, whatever you prefer. We would just welcome any questions that you might have. So joining us now, we have Professor Kalwant Bhopal. She is the Director of the Centre for Research in Race and Education at the University of Birmingham. Her latest book, White Privilege, The Myth of a Post-Racial Society, explores how, although we might like to think there's been progress with racial inclusion, there are many examples where discrimination against minority ethnic groups has actually increased. We also have joining us Professor Charles Egbu. He is the Vice Chancellor at Leeds Trinity University. He was the only black student in his class in the 80s and now is one of the only black Vice Chancellors in, well, history in the UK. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Charles with us today. We also have Dr. Michael Spence. He is the President and Provost at UCL, University College London. He's noted for his work on diversity and inclusion at University of Sydney, where he created the position of Deputy VC for Indigenous Strategy and Services. We'll actually hear him talk about that, so I think that's really, really interesting. And finally, Professor Shirley Congdon. She is the Vice Chancellor at the University of Bradford. Alongside her Pro-VC Chancellor for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, Odi Archibong, Shirley is leading Bradford to become a non-racist university. So thank you everyone for joining us. Pleasure to have you today. So I think, don't need to listen to me rattle on, let's get straight into it. What barriers do BME staff experience with career progression? I'm going to start with Shirley there, because I understand you had a little bit of research in your own institution.
Yeah, thanks, Coco. Well, clearly there are many, many barriers, but ultimately when we look at this, it is because of serious structural inequalities that are happening right across the sector. And I think at its heart, there is a problem with the HE sector in that the academy doesn't want to recognise that there's actually a problem in recognising the lack of progression. And therefore what happens, the underrepresentation of people from minority ethnic groups just gets exacerbated and becomes a vicious circle where they don't see people in positions of seniority and start to feel that perhaps they haven't got the necessary skills or abilities to actually apply or consider putting themselves forward. And there's also a lack of opportunity. The opportunity for people from minority ethnic groups is less than it is for other groups, and that's access to leadership programs, to mentorship, and this is long-standing and historic, and we can compare that to the opportunities that students have, which is different. So in many respects, people are treated differently, and this is because of just long-standing lack of representation.
So where's the pressure point? Where is it going wrong?
Well, when you think about how we recruit staff, so when we listened to the report that was presented earlier from Tessa, she talked about the governing bodies. And in some respects, what we need to have at a senior level, an executive level, and a governing body level is more accountability and more challenge, because it is totally unacceptable, the levels of representation, and this has been going on for many, many years. So somewhere along the line, at every level, in fact, people are not being appointed or not even getting onto a shortlist because of reasons that are largely down to things to do with structural inequalities, whether it's race, whether it's gender, whether it's where you live, whether it's what school you went to, whether it's what university you went to. So we really need to have more accountability and more challenge in the system so that people have equal opportunity to develop, to progress, to be considered and to be supported in the same way. So equality of opportunity is really important, and that sometimes means doing things differently for different groups. So somehow we need to put in place a circuit breaker. Something has to stop. We can work at all at a general level and all talk about and accept the fact there's a problem, but we also need to take some positive action in some areas. And this might mean putting in place for different institutions, depending on what's needed, some particular programs alongside a general approach, which has got to be strong leadership, acknowledging that we have racism going on in our institutions. And when I took up post in 2019, I was very clear, I'm not going to shy away from the fact that we need to be an anti-racist university. And that's what we're working on through all of our approach to strategy. But along with strategy, you need to do an awful lot of hard work with the staff and students and the communities that you serve.
Well, I wanted to bring you in here because I remember when we spoke earlier, you talked about covert and overt experiences for the actual higher education professionals themselves. I wonder if you could share that with our audience.
So there's a huge amount of evidence to suggest that BME academics, and I know that term is contested, but I will use it and we can discuss it perhaps later. The BME academics on a daily basis continue to experience covert and overt processes of racism. So I absolutely agree with what Shirley has said. We have to, at first, acknowledge racism, structural and institutional racism, because a failure to acknowledge racism results in a failure to act upon it. And it's good to see that universities are actually now doing this. But there are processes of microaggressions that BME academics continue to experience. And there is also recent evidence to suggest that white middle-class men in student evaluations are more likely to be graded higher compared to women, or in fact BME academics. And this is a really important issue because it will have a knock-on effect in terms of who universities will employ and also career trajectories for those individuals. So I think that there's a whole myriad of issues here that are very, very complex, but overt and covert processes of racism continue to be experienced by BME staff on a daily basis.
I'm fascinated with that bit of research because, you know, so much of how we want to approach attacking a problem like racism, we want to use data points and we want to use kind of policies and spreadsheets, and actually if so much of the experience is covert, is, for example, how do you record a microaggression? Is there a chart that says this counts, this doesn't count? It can be very overwhelming, and I'm sure as leaders in your field, it's something that you have to wrestle with every day. I wanted to therefore ask you where you have seen success, where the policies have been working, what initiatives are doing the trick. I'll send that one to Michael first, because we mentioned earlier when you were at Sydney the creation of that deputy VC, deputy VC for Indigenous strategy. How did that come about? How did that go? How was it received? Can you tell us more about
that? Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about the creation of the DVC, Indigenous Strategy and Services, but it's really important to understand that in the Australian context, Indigenous affairs is not a diversity issue. Indigenous people were the first people in Australia. Australia has always and will always be Aboriginal land. And so in a sense, the diversity issues are for everybody else. What we did was recognise that for us it was an ontological issue, that if we were ever going to be an Australian university and not merely a sort of vanilla European university or an international university transplanted, we needed to know what it meant to live and work in a place that people had been living and working and learning and studying for 70,000 years as a part of one of the oldest continuing living cultures on Earth. And so for us, that's a very different conversation to the diversity conversation, except in my current institution, diversity also has a sort of ontological status. You know, we were founded as a university for people who couldn't get into Oxford or Cambridge because they wouldn't sign the 39 articles. And therefore diversity ought to be deep in our self-identity. And in lots of ways, it is in the way that we talk about ourselves. And yet, if you look at our leadership group, we don't live true to those values. And I agree with so much of what's been said so far about the problem, the first issue being university niceness, right? We're all progressive, we're all nice, we all want to So we couldn't possibly have a problem with this, could we? And therefore, a first step in doing something about it is just to talk, to unpeel the evidence, to demonstrate to the community as a whole that there's an issue, to help people understand the impact of stereotyping effect on both on performance and also on the way in which performance is received, and then to count, to make sure that you have clear targets, you're holding people accountable against, and you are purposive about meeting them. Because one of the things about university communities, just like any large organisations, is that what gets measured gets done. But that's difficult in this area.
Well, on that about measuring, I mean, and I know what you mean about everyone, the niceness of it. If I have to hear the word inclusive again, I hear inclusive all the time. My gym's inclusive, everything's inclusive, and it's wonderful, but what does it mean? And what does this actually mean? What's the definition of it?
It's also kind of right with a whole set of assumptions, right? That there is a university in which you want to include people. But the whole point of having a leadership structure that reflects the diversity of our communities and therefore is stronger on the basis of all the decision-making parameters and all the rest of it is that you want your university to be different, not people included in your university, but your university to change to reflect the diversity of the community that it serves.
I suppose with UCL, I mean, London is such an international cosmopolitan place. It feels very real, that issue. I mean, I don't know if was that something you felt as well, like specifically that it's a London university, this has got to be number one?
Yeah, we share the DNA of the city in so many ways, and yet our leadership structure does not reflect the diversity of the city. And that's something we really have to address if we want to be the quality university that we're aspiring to be. Because it's about quality, right? It's not about social justice. It's about all the evidence demonstrates that more diverse teams make better decisions on all the parameters. So it's about excellence.
I wanted to ask you again, I know this was about Sydney, but quite often when these roles are created for diversity, they don't actually have any power. It's almost kind of like a showboating exercise. And I just wanted to know, like, when these positions are created, like, is it hard to win over to win over governing bodies, for example, that these should be created, or not really?
So I think it's not hard to get, implicit in so much of what's been said so far is that it's not hard to get people to say the right thing and therefore to agree to the creation of these posts. These posts have the problems that anybody has in a matrix structure who has a thematic rather than a line responsibility. If you have a line responsibility, you can make sure that things are done. If you have a matrix structure, you've got to be continually trying to talk people into things. But that's again where I think senior leadership weight and council weight behind the issue, and also and also measures for performance of the institution across the institution are really important, so that people can have the conversation that says, well, in your part of the university, there is no cultural diversity. There is no diversity on the basis of gender. Why? And what are you doing about it?
Yes, absolutely. Jolie, I wanted to bring you in there because you also have a senior appointment which has power and can actually hold other university staff and departments to account. What's that experience been like?
Yeah, well, it's been amazing. I mean, I think first of all, what I want to say is that there is this positional power, but there's also power by virtue of your expertise and your leadership. And what we need is a mixture of both. But you need the people who are in powers of position to be able to lead on this important issue. And if those people can't do that, then they are should not be legitimately appointed. I think it goes back to the appointment of people. We really need to be making sure that our leaders have got the right values, the right strength, and the right tenacity to be able to deliver on this agenda. So in my experience, wanting to appoint a Pro-Vice Chancellor for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion wasn't a difficult thing to do. Some people might not have agreed with me, but nobody said they didn't. If they did, they've kept silent on that matter. And not only did we appoint a professor and a Pro-Vice Chancellor for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, that person that was appointed, Professor Rudy Archibong, said, right, we need some associate deans in this space who are going to work in the faculties and the professional services to deliver on our strategy for equality, diversity and inclusion. And we need, as Michael said, a set of KPIs that will be part of that strategy, but our university KPIs. So the key thing is you've got to tie the performance down to the strategy, not just on research and innovation and business, community engagement, learning and teaching. You've got to tie it down in front of what you want to see your organisation to be and measure against it. And we'll all be coming from different starting points on this, but I do think we all need to make sure that we're seeing a progression going forward and we know what the distance to travel is. And also not to have measures that are just quantitative measures. We need softer measures. We need qualitative measures as well, spiced indicators.
I want to bring Charles in on this one. We've talked a lot about, having a vision and working towards it. But as an outsider who does not work in universities, I struggle to understand what that could actually look like. And I wanted to ask you, bit of a big one, but what would an inclusive culture, which is what we talk a lot about, what would that actually look like? Does that mean quotas? Does it mean or targets of some kind? Does it mean curriculum? What does it mean?
Coco, thank you so much for the opportunity. Can I just start by saying that this whole issue is real for those who have lived experience in this. Having a vision, I think it's really, really important. The role of the leader, absolutely important. The culture is important. I think it's Gert Hofstede who reminded us that culture, it's the belief system, is our values, the way we work in here. And I think it's important because for me, an inclusive university or an environment or a workplace is that workplace that values the individuals at one level and the group differences in the workplace. And I think that's absolutely important. I'd also like to make sure that culture, which too often is misconceived in certain quarters, somehow we think of culture as an intangible asset or intangible sets of values that trickle down from the vice chancellor right to the bottom. In actuality, my take and my experience over the last 35 years, working with lots of Black and Asian academics, the true culture of an organization, especially in the university, is the cumulative product of the day-to-day interactions between the colleagues or the leaders or the managers and the teams. It's how you live out the way you do things here. So having a voice, I think it's important for me. I think a sense of belonging is important to me. What the individual makes of the racial microaggressions, the hyper surveillance, which they often look, how they query themselves, whether they as individuals have the skills and competencies. Because at times, some of these people with lived experience look inwards and ask themselves, is there something wrong with me? Are with me? What is it I cannot see in myself? So access to resources, that strategic alignment which organizations have to think about in terms of how they see an individual as unique, but contribute that uniqueness amongst the so many. The collaborative environment, so that one way of articulating this in a tangible form is, how does that culture impact on the recruitment process and the application, assessment, interviews, and selection? How does it represent itself in the committees and the panels, the appraisal ratings, the promotions, the training attendance? I remember one colleague who I was mentoring looked at me and said, Charles, do you know I struggle too much trying to fight all this, and I don't even have the time to actually do the work I need to be doing. Are with me? So we need not to get into that situation. Yes, the vision, the strategy is important. The culture, which I think is more challenging, which for me, organizational climate is different from what I call the culture, which is a long time stay. So there are so many things we need to do. Leadership has a role to play, and so is everyone in the organization has a role to play. If I have the opportunity, I would like to decipher that, but I wonder if we'll have the opportunity to do so.
Well, we certainly have the time. So please, by all means, tell us.
I think when one looks at how this works in real life, and I've had the opportunity of mentoring over 60 Black and Asian mid-level and senior people, and when you look at some of the challenges they have with mid-level managers, where discussions around their P&D, the performance development, where they are passed by in terms of opportunities to attend training, for secondment, to be involved in real projects, when they are asked to have mentors, when they're asked to have coaches, when the issue of sponsorship comes to bear. And it's really, really challenging. And the individual who is having these lived experiences go back and go back and go back, and one reaches a situation because of the nature of the environment, says, you know what, where do I spend my next energy in? Is it this, or do I just give up? And God knows how many times people have told me, Charles, I've wanted to give up on several occasions, but I just don't know where I've got the ounce of energy. We shouldn't allow that to happen. It's happening in many, many organizations. And that's why in my own university, I think having that race equality charter, bronze, having action plans that jump out of the paper that is meaningful, having a dedicated, what I call Office of Institutional Equity that doesn't reside in the HR, that has the opportunity of cutting across the whole university, shining a light on what is not happening, and creating an environment which everyone has the opportunity to speak out. I think for me, that's what an inclusive culture is. You feel it. You really, really feel it. And that's where I think we need to get to.
So from, again, you know, as an outsider that works in universities, it all sounds like, these all sound like brilliant plans. And I can't help but wonder, but why couldn't we have done them 5 years ago? Why couldn't we have done them 10 years ago? What's changed that makes now possible? And what happened that meant progress didn't happen? Actually, I want to send that one to Culwant first, if I may.
That's a really good question. So I think that we've had the eruption, haven't we, of the Black Lives Matter protests, which were absolutely global. So consequently, as a result of that, race has been brought into the social, economic and political and media climate. So everybody has been forced actually to think about race. And consequently, universities have been forced to address their own good practices in relation to how they take race forward. So I would argue that universities have actually been forced to do this, particularly in relation to addressing their curriculum, addressing their representation. And I think it's already been said that universities do not represent the communities that they serve. I just want to pick up on Charles's point about the Race Equality Charter. I think it's really interesting to look at the numbers of universities that are signed up to the Race Equality Charter compared to the numbers of universities who are signed up to the Athena Swan Charter. The numbers are very wide and very, very different. So what we have is, we have institutions and vice chancellors who are very passionate about these particular issues and have social justice at the heart of their agenda. They are the ones who sign up to the Race Equality Charter. So why aren't all vice chancellors signing up to it? And we can see that discrepancy, the way in which historically actually, and through policy making, gender has always been given precedence over race, and race has always taken a secondary priority in policy making in higher education. And I think that quite often what happens in universities under the umbrella of EDI, equality, diversity and inclusion, universities can say that they are actually addressing race, when in fact what they're doing is addressing gender. So we have this hierarchy of oppression and a discourse of denial that racism actually exists. So in that respect, the Race Equality Charter is a step forward. And the easy thing, I think, is getting the Race Equality Charter, gaining that bronze award. I think the hard thing is addressing how you will make those changes, as Charles has outlined. So the Race Equality Charter mark holds universities to account. So I think we have to be really clear when we look at policy making and the ways in which this hierarchy of oppression means that race is diluted. And I think in some respects, the Equality Act is actually to blame for this, because what the Equality Act did was brought together previous legislation into a single act, but it introduced protected characteristics, of which race is one. But what it's actually done is diluted that importance of race.
I am conscious we're going to go into the Q&A section now, but actually there was one that we got in advance that I want to send to you first to kick off this part of it. So again, reminder for our audience, if you would like to send a question, please do in the right hand chat box. Our moderator will go through them and hopefully we'll be able to get through as many as we can. So one I received in advance was, do we need to distinguish more between ethnic minorities to better understand their barriers? So I think that's a question about, you know, we sort of hinted at it earlier, POC, BME, but even in terms of understanding our policies, do we need to separate them out? I'll open that to the floor. Anyone, please, go straight in there. Let's go, Michael.
So I think there are a number of reasons why this has become an issue. One is because the UK itself is grappling with what it means to be a genuinely multicultural society and not merely one with a host culture and some visitors. But the second is that gender is in some senses easier to deal with because the categories of identification are more straightforward, and the lived experience of people has more shared commonalities. Whereas the lived experience of people in the race environment is very different and requires really quite different thinking. So say, for example, there's a lot of xenophobia at the moment. Some of it dressed up as criticism of the Chinese Communist Party, some of it just straightforward racism. And, we had a Singaporean student who was beaten in the street, for example, around COVID. And what our East Asian staff are telling me is that London's a really uncomfortable place to be East Asian at the moment. And part of their particular challenge is that people in the UK don't particularly recognise them as a disempowered group. So one of them was telling the story of a photo being taken for some sort of university publication. And the person organising the photos said to her, look, there are just too many East Asian photos in this faces in this picture. And she did not say, but says she thought, well, what about if you were to substitute East Asian for black in this context, or East Asian for South Asian in this context? The construction of the East Asian identity and its experience of oppression in the UK is quite different. And I think in the kind of way that Shirley was talking about, you have to have, and this is for us led by the kind of person Charles was talking about, our pro-provost EDI, who's directly accountable to me. You have to be having smart conversations at every level of the organisation that challenges the, if you like, interracial assumptions.
Charles, let me get you in this one as well.
Coco, I think the intersectionality, I think it's important. Because at every level, I think it's fair to say at times we have multiple identities and at times they overlap. And I think it's important to use multiple lenses to look at this. And for example, one could argue, does a woman from an ethnic minority background have more equal opportunities to progress on gender than because she's from an ethnic minority background? Are with me? And depending on which one the university is pushing at any one time, you could begin to see, whilst that I think it's important. And it's also more important given how a university wants to approach a particular issue, gender and race, at any one time. For example, through positive action or extended positive action, one begins to see the interplay between ethnicity and diversity. So, and that's why it's important that we consider that very, very seriously. Yeah.
Pawan, please.
Yeah, so I was just going to pick up on the point about definitions and categories. So we have the category BME, we have the category BAME. And I think that I personally don't like either of those categories. And, I've seen throughout my career, various different categories used. But I think what's really, really important is those of us researching this area, it's really important to understand, and for universities actually to understand, that there are differences within and between those categories. So we cannot use that individual category as BAME or BME to describe a group because it isn't homogenous. Even the category Black, for instance, has diversity within it. We've got Black African, Black Caribbean, Black Somalian, etc., and the category Asian. So I think the danger is of lumping all of the groups together, which assumes homogeneity of experience. And that is not the case for academics of colour or BME academics, and certainly isn't the case for students. So I think that universities do make that mistake, and what they need to do is to be A, consistent in their terminology, and B, to make sure that they recognise that there are differences within that and all the groups that encompasses. And I think that in some respects, it's really important to understand that a person of colour will not have the same experiences, as Charles has just said. Within that, there are differentials around social class background, around gender, around age, disability, etc., etc. So it's far more complex than thinking just singularly about how identities impact, particularly in relation to inequality.
And that's why it's all about working on a core intellectual skill. The problem is othering, whatever you use to do the othering. And part of what you need, in the kind of way Charles was talking about, is at every level of the organization to get people to challenge their own capacity for othering.
And to also challenge their own white privilege, and to have uncomfortable conversations about the perpetuation of white privilege and how that works in universities, in which universities want to recruit in their own image. So hence they do not represent the communities that they serve. And I think that notion of understanding white privilege and having uncomfortable conversations about what it means is really, really important, and something that universities must begin to do if they are serious about issues of social justice.
Shirley, I saw you had your hand up there. What are your thoughts on this, having a further breakdown of what it is to be BAME or BME or POC or whatever?
So, I sort of want to say two things. I think the first thing I want to say is we've really got to understand that we are all individuals. I think Charles pointed to it. We're all special. We're all unique. We're all made up of lots of different experiences, backgrounds, cultures, as Colwant has just said. And therefore, what we want is to create an atmosphere in our organisations where you can be that person that you are without fear or favour, where you can come and have every opportunity that the next person you work with has. And it's all about creating that, but creating it means that, as we've just been hinting there, we've not just got to hint at it. We do have to tackle this notion of privilege and how some groups have been advantaged over others because they've looked after themselves, let's face it, and continue to promulgate their priority and their position in society. So that is a really, really difficult thing to tackle. But I think what Charles and others are saying, and what we're saying on this call, is we've got to start having those conversations. And they are difficult, and they will be long, they will go on for a long time. And, we had a discussion at the University of Bradford about standing out and saying we want to be an anti-racist organisation, but what does it mean? And does everybody know what we mean by that? And does everybody know we're on a long journey if that's what we want to achieve? Regardless of any kite marks or anything like that, this is what we want to achieve. So I think, if you had that approach, you'd think less about the different groups. You'd think more about the individual differences and wanting to embrace that difference and leverage difference and leverage the diversity. I suppose we get mixed up with accounting bit, but we still do have to do the counting. But the other thing I wanted to say as well is, like, some people have said, and some recruitment firms actually say, that there's a shortage of talent. There isn't any shortage of talent. There's a shortage of being able to liberate it and use it appropriately.
That brings us quite nicely to our first audience question. Thank you so much again to the audience, and please do keep them coming. How did the panel feel about blind recruitment, i.e. let's redact all the personal information? Is this something that is going to help unconscious bias? But also, aren't people's identities part of their brilliance? What? I'll open it out to whoever wants to chip in first. Blind recruitment. Charles, thank you.
Can I say that's a very, very important question. I've had an opportunity to put that in practice in my previous institutions. It has lots of merit because everyone is on a level playing field. But there's some dangers around that in certain kinds of roles, especially in academic roles where you want to have an idea, some of the backdrop of where an individual goes. So I think when doing this, you need to do that in combination, not just using that as just one fell swoop or a particular gun that is put to deal with everything. There is merit in it, but you have to handle it very, very carefully.
So, I mean, we did work in experimental economics at the University of Sydney that demonstrated that on identical CVs across large cohorts of employers, if you had a Chinese first name and last name, you were a third as likely to get an interview as if you had a European first name and last name. If you had a European first name with a Chinese last name, you were almost as likely to get an interview as a person with a European first name and last name. I mean, I think the dynamics of bias in the recruitment process are very complex, but whether or not simple blind recruiting is a sort of blanket solution, I have some of Charles' skepticism.
Yes, Shirley.
Well, I agree. I think it should be part of a whole approach to open recruitment. But open recruitment itself needs to be carefully designed, and people need to understand it, and it's got to be part of the broader system of what you're doing to level out.
And recruitment agents can be awful. We had a process a little while ago, just a month ago, where one of the big recruitment firms, not Gatton Biss Anderson, had come up with an all-male list. And I said, you know, this is a historic artifact. We've excluded 51% of the population. And they said, oh yeah, but we've ticked other diversity boxes. You know, look at him and look at him. That kind of mindset amongst recruitment agents is a real problem.
I think also the problem with it is, for me, is that there's an assumption that if names are taken off, that eliminates all bias, but that would not happen because other biases would actually creep in. For example, the type of university that an individual has gone to. And there's a huge amount of data to show that BME students who have similar A-level grades are less likely to be offered places at Russell Group or elite universities. So I think that this would actually open up another can of worms and is hugely problematic because other biases would immediately creep in, and which would actually be to the detriment of BME groups.
So we've had a question here which is about, I'll read it all out, but I really want to focus on the last bit. So it says, what actions have been taken that has made a difference in HE? How do we share this with others? So the stuff that's made a difference. But this bit I think is fantastic. How do we share what has not worked? We never talk about what didn't work. And I wondered if any of you would be so bold as to perhaps open that up. What hasn't worked in these attempts to create more diverse leaders at universities?
Well, I guess the obvious thing, because we've been talking about it, what hasn't worked is having senior executive teams and councils, governing bodies that aren't diverse. That has contributed to the situation that we're in now. What I'm enjoying now in my position is having an executive team that is more diverse than we've previously had in this institution. And we are, you know, deliberate in our attempt to be more diverse at every level. What hasn't worked is just talking about it. So I think people could probably find some, you know, small scale maybe interventions, or maybe some things that we spent a lot of money on in some areas that haven't worked. What hasn't worked, I think, is putting a campaign out to say in the health sector to recruit more males into nursing, or to recruit more people from a Black, Asian, minority backgrounds into healthcare, and then not follow it on with progression routes because they are seriously underrepresented in the NHS. So what hasn't worked is not having a whole system approach to it and just seeing things in different strands as different individual work streams.
I mean, the other shameful thing, Coco, is we're not far enough advanced in this area to know what hasn't worked. You know, I think we are in relation to cultural and linguistic diversity in universities sort of where we were in relation to gender in the early 1970s. We're just beginning to be able to legitimize the conversation.
Yes, Carolyn, yes, please.
So I think what hasn't worked is when universities have a tick box exercise where they say that they are addressing issues of racial inequality, but only doing so to tick a box and for their own, for the fact that it benefits the universities. So, for instance, some universities who may sign up to the Race Equality Charter Mark will actually use that as a performative action, will actually enact inclusion by saying, oh, look at us, we've signed up to the Race Equality Charter Mark. But in effect, that does not result in any real significant changes in how they are being more inclusive of BME groups. So I think that what doesn't work and what hasn't worked is when some universities use these exercises by performing inclusion and by ticking a box. And also they can sell themselves as fair and unique to students who are paying £9,250 a year to come to their universities. But in effect, nothing within that university has actually changed.
Yeah, the apparatus is still there. Charles, what hasn't worked?
Can I just say, can I just turn it around? Because I've been part of a group that has wanted to put in place something that has real potential to be impactful and successful. And things like good mentoring, good role modeling, good use of positive actions, good use of sponsorship. On paper, these things could have worked well, but the way they are implemented, initiated, and not sustained over a period of time made it fall flat, and people lost confidence in the system. Are you with me? So we just need to be bold. We need to be clear, as Shirley pointed out. This is a long race, not a sprint. To see some of these things through, and we need to really be clear that these things are meaningful, and then towards the end measure the impactfulness. So there needs to be clear criteria, clear matrices, clear KPIs. They may have good intention, but somehow it's not been taken forward in a meaningful, realistic way.
And I think for that to be, I think Carl's point is really interesting about whose good you're doing it for, because I've found that it's easier to engage the community precisely if it's not an issue about social justice, but is an issue about the performance of the team, because it kind of harnesses it to the self-interest of the institution, because we know for a fact that teams are better the more diverse they are. I mean, there is libraries of social science that demonstrates that's the case. So I totally agree with you, Carwyn, that if it's just a performative, we've got the kite mark, then it's sort of nauseating and actually takes you backwards. But to give the schemes that Charles is talking about the kind of oomph they need, people have got to know that it's serious business for the university, not just a kind of nice to do.
And I think that's a really important point, because there's a huge amount of evidence to show that diverse teams are not only more productive, they are happier, they work better, and their outcomes are much better. So it isn't really rocket science. I mean, there's a huge amount of evidence to show that. And I just want to pick up on Charles's point around mentoring. I think mentoring, if it's done well, and if it's done at the correct time of career trajectories, and if it is done in such a way where, for instance, some academics say they want to be mentored by somebody from the same ethnic group as them, if all of these things are taken into consideration, it can work extremely well. But sadly, there are lots of examples of very bad practice around mentoring. So I think it has to be done well for it to be effective.
I agree.
I wanted to talk, well, I think the sense I get from yourselves, certainly from myself and certainly from our audience is, everyone's agreed it's not rocket science. So why is it so slow, and what can we do to speed it up? So we had an anonymous question here actually, which said, what carrots can be used to help UK higher education institutions move forward faster? Would a threat of funding help? Something like they did with Athena Swan. Carwyn, yes, please.
Yes, what a fantastic question. So everybody probably knows my views on this, but I think the Race Equality Charter Mark must be linked to funding. When it was announced by the NIHR, the National Institute for Health Research, that the universities could only apply for biomedical funding if they were signed up to the Athena Swan Charter, the number of institutions that signed up to the Athena Swan Charter in 1 week increased by 400%. So every university must sign up to the Race Equality Charter. If they are not signed up, they should not be allowed to apply for funding. It must be linked to funding in order for it to take impact. Now, I mean, you just have to look at the numbers of universities that are signed up to it and compare that to the number of universities that are signed up to the Athena Swan Charter, because that's what it's all about. It's about money. And I think that's where the significant difference you would see.
Charles, yes.
Can I say I agree that there's nothing that hits an organization more than the bottom line. Are with me? But we also need to be very, very mindful that part of what we are talking about here, it's structural and it's cultural. I know many organizations that have been penalized in an area outside HE, who can absorb that penalty financially. Are with me? But it doesn't impact on the kind of stuff we're talking about. There is something around culture that I think we need to understand, that it's highly embedded, it's highly intricate, and there are so many things that come together. One could be the financial side, but there's the other thing. So whilst I agree that that will really wake up everyone, we just need to see that to get this going, it has to be looked at in an aligned, holistic way. If it's going to be sustained, because you may get the financial bait being brought by a particular government. 4 or 5 years, another government comes and removes that. Are with me? But the culture is here for a very long time. So we just need to be very, very mindful about the intricacies about this very complex area. Thank you.
Yeah. I'm not so keen on the link to funding, because in reality, we've got to create universities that have got a strong social conscience and then understand what they are here for, to give people opportunities to have happy, healthy lives and to prosper. And that means in equal measures for as many, for all. And if you think about a place like Bradford and West Yorkshire and the areas that Charles and I are working in, there are serious areas of poverty and deprivation, in-work poverty. Young Asian women not getting jobs even when they've graduated for many reasons, and it's not just because they don't want to. There's lots of reasons, there's lots of things that are going on to create serious inequalities, structural inequalities, and they're leading to people having unhealthy lives, and they're having shorter lives. And we all know the statistics about, the difference in life expectancy of 12.5 years from one ward in the same area to the next, and that's all because of poverty. And the poverty is inextricably linked to education, to progression, to careers. So there has to be something that is a whole system, political, local authority, university, businesses working together to champion and lead together some of these issues. I think system leaders have got to stand up together on this issue.
So we've had a question in from Afua. Thank you, Afua. It says, there tends to be a disproportionate focus on recruitment because it's more comfortable than speaking about retention or an inability to retain and advance talent from ethnic minorities. That's something that I suppose we haven't really talked about, is people leaving the workforce. I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on that. I'll open it out to the floor. Charles, yes, please.
I think that's a very, very good observation. Too often we talk about people coming in, less on how we look after those who are in there and why people leave. And that's why I think some of the things we talked about has to be contextualized. Some of these very, very issues around microaggression, issues around perhaps poor promotion approaches, issues around people feeling a little bit, shall I say, unworthy, unvalued. It's so important. And part of the constructs I think we need to put in place as we try to make sure of what is an inclusive culture is to have matrices that talks about how many people are living, how many minority ethnic people are leaving the organization, and try to also have exit interview to know exactly why they are living and where are they going to. If we can ascertain that, are with me? Are they going to, unquote, other organizations that are more likely to look after them, unquote? It's so important because part of my mentoring of a number of black mid-level managers, they ring me over the weekend or in the evenings and say, Charles, I really have had enough. And I want them to tell me more what's going on. He says, look, I'm living not because I don't like my disciplinary area, but the environment is too hot and toxic for me and I don't have anywhere to turn. Are with me? And I'm just living. I just cannot fight it anymore, unquote. So I think we also need to be looking at that part of it. I think it's important. And you get that through lived experiences and try to unearth what's really behind that. So it's a very good observation from the one who asked the question.
I think that's a really good question as well, because I think that quite often a lot of the emotional labour that BME academics have to put into their job is unaccounted for. So, for instance, there's a lot of evidence to show that BME students are more likely to go to BME lecturers and staff. And so there is that additional emotional baggage and emotional support that BME academics give to BME students. And I think the other thing that universities must be mindful of is to think about how they are looking after the mental health issues of BME staff, who from not only do they do this additional labour that isn't accounted for, that isn't refable, that isn't in the workload model, etc., but in addition to that, they experience racism on a daily basis. So I do think that universities must really think carefully about the support that they are providing to prevent BME academics leaving institutions and indeed leaving higher education.
Right. So our next question is asking for some advice. They say there are already entrenched executives in higher education who are just not on board with EDI. How do you act as change agents within these circles? It's a big one, I know. Sort of dropped that on you there. Sorry about that. But I think it speaks to a very big question, which is when there's resistance, how do you overcome it? And all of you have done that in your own way. So I hope you have some great words here. Shirley, let's go to you.
Well, I guess we've all got our own circles of influence, and we've got to speak out. So you've got 4 of us on the call today. We're all in senior positions. It's incumbent upon us to amplify, and we are today, discrimination. And not just within our own institutions, but outside as well. So I'm chair of Yorkshire Universities Network. I've got access to other vice chancellors that I work with. We've got Universities UK. They are working on this issue. They've produced work, research on this. We need to do more, for sure. We need to do more, but it is incumbent upon us to lead from our positional powers and our powers of influence. We've got a world-leading academic on the call here who's written, significantly on this, Calwant, and we've got to be promoting the work of others. We can't be bystanders. We've got to amplify and share our experiences and convene events like this ourselves and involve our students and our partners in our own local authorities.
I think there's also a role, and I realise that this is tough for people, but in skeptical environments, in people telling their story. So I remember when in writing our second strategy at Sydney, culture was going, there was an education section, a research section, a culture section, and diversity work was a big part of the culture section. I began the consultation with meeting of all staff, and there lined up in the front row were the white late middle age leaders of the trade union, and I started to talk about diversity and why we needed to work on it. And there was a certain amount of sort of eye rolling and sniggering and the rest of it. And then in the question time, one very brave woman stood up and said, well, you can tell from my accent that I'm from a culturally and linguistically diverse group. I have worked at the University of Sydney for 30 years. I love the place to bits. I love my colleagues. I love what I do. But I have to say, I've never really felt a part of the place. And I think that's got something to do with my cultural identity. And the whole conversation shifted. All of a sudden the union became enthusiastic. And while it takes a particular kind of courage and a particular kind of person, and you don't want to place on individual staff the burden of being the representative of, BAME staff generally, or their cultural group, or whatever it might be. I think in organisations where leadership is sceptical, the power of the individual narrative can be very strong.
I also think that there's something that everyone can do. I mean, you may argue that it's a small thing. I think that if any of us witness racism in higher education, we must call it out. Because if we don't do that, we are complicit in perpetuating racism, and we are complicit in perpetuating white privilege. And that's why I think the role of white allies is really, really important here. And I think that we need to call out racism when we see it. We need to challenge it. And we need to do that in relation to white allies who may be in more senior positions and more powerful positions than us. Because I think that one could argue that's a small point, but I think it's a really, really important point, because otherwise such behaviour either goes unrecognised or unnoticed, or is seen as taken for granted. And I think that that's something that we really all of us need to do.
I think that's hugely important. And, it doesn't have to be a great crusade. It can be the quizzical question to the boss that says, do you think that people might be saying that partly because she's Indian? Or do you think, the way that opens up the question about the way in which racism happens and confronts people with the issue, I think is hugely important. And I think even junior staff can do it.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be confrontational, and it doesn't have to be aggressive. It's exactly as you've just said, it can be like that. But I think that's so important, because otherwise we are all complicit in it if we don't call it out.
Right. I'm very sorry, we are out of time. I'm very sorry. Oh, actually, Charles, we had a question in that's just directly for you. So I'm just going to give it to you really quickly, but we have to be very fast. It says, to start doing what Charles is talking about, so that is remaking culture, create real change, should we start educating people on what the actual meaning of anti-racism is?
I think we need to do that. And I have to say a huge thanks and congratulations to Shirley for calling out in her university that it's going to be an anti-racist university. That takes real leadership. And that conversation, I think it's important. And I know we talked about, we all know the importance and benefit of diversity. I think we shouldn't take that for granted. We should, at every stage, continuously make a business case for diversity in our institution. All the way, getting allies to work with us, but leadership, influence at the top level, and I have to say even within the Board of Governors level, to help leverage this, to make sure that we're not just talking about it, it's meaningful and it's measurable throughout that journey.
Right, fantastic. Well, I mean, that is the perfect note, rallying cry to leave this panel. Thank you so much to everyone that joined us. I really appreciate you tuning in. And of course, thank you to our wonderful leading panel, Calwant, Shirley, Charles, Michael, thank you. Excellent questions, all round, excellent answers. Just a very small bit of admin while I still have you. At the end of this, there's going to be a short survey. Fill it in if you can. We're still doing our virtual events. We love to hear how we can improve. We'll be emailing you in the following week to send you a recording of this. So if you missed a bit, don't worry about it. We'll also send you a write-up of the event. One of our journalists is in the audience and we'll be doing that. I will let you all get on with your day, but thank you to Gayton B. Sanderson for their support in bringing this together, their wonderful report, which we hope we'll be able to send around again. And I think I've managed to do that in time. Okay, so thank you, everyone, and have a lovely day.
Thank you.
Thank you.